Spring came late to the high country, and Thomas Edwards knew every mile of the fence line by heart. He rode it every week with his children beside him, 10-year-old Sarah on the dappled mare, 8-year-old Samuel on the sturdy pony checking posts and wire with the steady rhythm of duty. Arid and sure. The land stretched wide and empty under a pale sky, patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed places where winter refused to release its grip. Iowa Champlain Sauce. They crested the ridge above Willow Creek, and Thomas reined his horse without thinking. Below in the clearing, a lone figure moved with methodical purpose. A woman, her dark hair tied back with a faded ribbon, worked a rope and pulley system to lift a log into place. Her movements were practiced, efficient, solitary. The half-built cabin rose from the earth like a promise being kept one piece at a time. Thomas had been watching her progress for 3 weeks now. Each time they passed, the structure stood taller. Foundation stones set level and true. Corner posts plumb and solid. First courses of logs notched and fitted with careful precision. She worked alone. Always alone. And something about her determination stirred feelings he'd thought buried with Martha 2 winters past. Papa, why is that lady building all by herself? Sarah's voice carried concern beyond her years. Thomas looked at his daughter, saw Martha's kind eyes reflected there. The question lodged in his chest, like a splinter. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he had too many. Some folks chose solitude. Some had it thrust upon them. Some built walls of timber, while others built walls of grief. I don't know, sweetheart, he said finally. Samuel stood in his stirrups, craning for a better view. She's getting the logs up there all by herself. That's real clever with those ropes. The woman below paused, wiped her brow with her sleeve, then bent to her work again. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Thomas recognized something in her posture. The set of shoulders, carrying weight beyond physical labor. He knew that stance. He wore it himself most days. His horse shifted beneath him, and Thomas realized he'd been staring. He touched his heels to the animal's flanks, moving them along the fence line, but the image stayed with him. The woman and her rising cabin. The patches of snow giving way to bare ground. The sense that winter was ending for someone down there in that clearing, even if it still held him fast. She must be awful strong. Papa, Samuel said as they rode away. Thomas glanced back once. The woman had another log positioned, was working her pulley system with patient determination. The empty saddle to his right, the place where Martha used to ride, felt heavier than usual. His children's clothes showed the careful mending of inexpert hands. His wedding ring caught the thin sunlight. Strong. Yes. But strength came in different forms. Sometimes it looked like a woman building alone. Sometimes it looked like a man getting 2 children dressed and fed every morning, teaching them their letters at the kitchen table, holding himself together with nothing but will and routine. The woman disappeared from view as they descended the far side of the ridge, but Thomas knew they'd pass again next week. They always did. The fence line demanded attention, and maybe, he admitted only to himself, he wanted to see what she'd accomplished. Wanted to know if one person really could build something lasting entirely alone. He wasn't sure he believed it possible. 7 days brought them back to the ridge. Thomas told himself it was just the regular fence inspection. Nothing more. But he'd thought about that clearing more than once during the week. Wondered if the woman had made progress. Wondered if she had anyone checking on her. Bringing supplies. Lending a hand when the work grew too heavy. The cabin had grown. A full course of logs wrapped the perimeter now, and the woman was wrestling with a corner beam that would support the next level. She had it braced with temporary poles, was adjusting the position with careful precision. The spring sun had warmed the land, turning patches of earth muddy with snowmelt. You're doing real good. Ma'am. Samuel's voice rang out across the clearing before Thomas could stop him. The woman straightened, surprised. She shaded her eyes against the sun, looking up at them on the ridge. For a moment, Thomas thought she might wave them away, resenting the intrusion. Instead, she lifted one hand in acknowledgement, a simple gesture that somehow felt like an invitation. Sarah squeezed her father's arm. Papa, why doesn't she ask for help? Doesn't she have anybody? The question struck deeper than his daughter knew. Thomas heard himself answer, the words coming from some honest place he usually kept shuddered. Some folks need to prove they can stand on their own. Sometimes that's about pride. Sometimes it's about healing. Either way, a person's got a right to their own path. But even as he spoke, recognition settled over him like morning frost. He was describing himself as much as the woman below. He'd been standing on his own for 2 years now, refusing offers from neighbors, keeping his grief private and his heart locked away, managing, surviving, proving he could do it all without help. The woman turned back to her work, and they continued their ride. The fence line needed attention 3 posts loose, wire sagging in 2 places. Thomas and the children worked in companionable silence, the kind that had become their normal, not uncomfortable exactly, but not warm either, just the absence of conflict, the presence of routine. That evening at supper, the children were unusually quiet. Thomas ladled stew into their bowls, cut bread with careful attention. The kitchen was clean and functional. The house well maintained. Everything worked. Nothing felt alive. Sarah pushed her food around her plate, finally looking up. Mama used to say that accepting help with grace is harder than doing everything yourself. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He set down his spoon, stared at his daughter. Martha had said exactly that, more than once, during their courtship when he'd been too proud to admit he needed her. After Sarah was born, when he'd tried to manage the ranch and a newborn without asking anyone for assistance, she'd been patient with his stubborn independence, had gently worn down his walls until he understood that strength and connection weren't opposites. Mama was right about most things, Thomas said quietly. Samuel looked between his father and sister, sensing something important happening. The cabin lady looked lonely. Papa, like us. Like us. The words hung in the air. Thomas wanted to deny it, to say they were managing fine, to insist that loneliness was just a temporary state they'd grow out of eventually. But his son's eyes were too honest, too clear. Children saw what adults tried to hide. That night after tucking them in, Thomas stood at the kitchen window. The ranch spread out in the darkness, fence lines invisible but known by heart. He'd built a life here with Martha, after she died. He'd maintained it, with grim determination. But somewhere in the survival, they'd lost the living. He made a decision, small but significant. Next week when they rode the fence line, if that woman was struggling with anything at all, he'd offer help. Just neighborly kindness. Just the basic decency Martha would have shown, without hesitation. Nothing more complicated than that, but his heart beat faster at the thought. And Thomas recognized the feeling. It had been so long since he'd felt anything beyond duty and grief. This new sensation, anticipation, possibility. The first stirring of spring after endless winter, both frightened and called to him. He touched his wedding ring. A gesture become habit. Help me know what's right. Martha. He whispered to the darkness. The house gave no answer. But somewhere in the silence, Thomas felt the smallest shift. Not permission exactly, More like recognition that standing still was its own kind of surrender. The children slept down the hall, their breathing the only sound in the house. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in his cup, and let himself remember. Martha had died 2 winters ago during a cold snap that froze the water in the well. Fever had taken her fast. Too fast for the doctor to arrive from town. He'd held her hand and felt helpless, all his strength and resources meaning nothing against the simple fact of sickness. She'd squeezed his fingers at the end and whispered, "Love them enough for both of us." He'd tried. God knew he'd tried. The children had cried themselves hollow those first months. He'd held them and had no comfort to offer beyond his presence. Eventually they'd adapted, growing quieter, more self-contained. They functioned as a family unit, fed, clothed, schooled, safe. But the warmth had drained away, leaving only the mechanics of survival. The neighbors had brought casseroles and sympathy. They'd invited him to gatherings, church socials, barn raisings. Thomas had thanked them and declined, keeping his grief private. His household closed. One by one, the invitations stopped coming. People respected his boundary. Or maybe they just got tired of rejection. Either way, he'd become known as courteous but distant, a man locked in permanent winter. He pushed back from the table and walked through the dark house. Everything was in its place. Floors swept, dishes washed, laundry folded. The illusion of normalcy maintained through sheer force of will. But it was illusion. He knew it even if the children were too young to name it. At the doorway to the bedroom he'd shared with Martha, Thomas paused. He'd barely entered this room since her death. Her things remained exactly as she'd left them, hairbrush on the dresser, shawl across the chair. The book she'd been reading still marked halfway through. He'd built a shrine instead of a home. Thomas stepped inside, lit the lamp. Martha's photograph sat in its frame on the bedside table. She smiled out at him, captured in a moment of joy from their early years. Beautiful and alive, and so very gone. "I'm failing them," he said to the photograph. "Our children are becoming ghosts in their own home. They're so quiet now. Martha, so careful. They've learned to take up less space, to need less, to expect less. That's not what you wanted for them." The photograph offered no answer. But Martha's voice lived in his memory. She'd believed life was meant to be shared, that family grew through welcome and connection. She'd made their home a place of warmth and laughter. He was maintaining the structure while letting the spirit die. Thomas picked up the photograph, studied his wife's face. "I thought keeping busy meant keeping whole. I thought if I just managed everything, controlled everything, kept us moving forward, that would be enough. But it's not. Is it? They need more than food and shelter. They need warmth. They need laughter. They need someone to teach them that opening your heart isn't betrayal." He set the photograph down gently, made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. Tomorrow he'd ride the fence line as usual, but he wouldn't just watch anymore. If that woman needed help, he'd offer it. Not because she was incapable, her cabin proved otherwise, but because Martha had taught him that community wasn't weakness. Connection wasn't betrayal. Reaching out honored life instead of just preserving memory. "I think it's time to let spring come in, my dear," Thomas whispered. He extinguished the lamp and returned to the kitchen. Through the window, stars scattered across the black sky. The land lay waiting for warmth, for growth, for the season to finally turn. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready or not. But for the first time in 2 years, Thomas Edwards thought he might be ready to teach his children that strength included reaching out. Ready to show them that love didn't diminish when shared, but grew brighter like a well-tended fire, ready to take the first step out of winter into whatever came next. He touched his wedding ring one last time, then went to bed. Dreams came easier than they had in months. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright. Thomas woke the children early, and they went through their routine with unusual energy. Sarah noticed her father's different mood, kept glancing at him with curious eyes. Samuel chattered about a nest he'd seen in the barn, about the creek running high with snowmelt, about everything and nothing. They rode out mid-morning, following the familiar path toward the ridge. Thomas's heart beat faster as they approached. He'd rehearsed words in his mind, simple offers of help, neighborly courtesy, but they all sounded hollow. What mattered was the action, not the explanation. The cabin came into view. Elizabeth was wrestling with a roof beam, trying to maneuver it into position alone. The beam was perhaps 20 feet long, awkward more than impossibly heavy, but dangerous if it fell. She had it braced on sawhorses, was attempting to leverage one end upward. Thomas made his decision in an instant. He dismounted, handed his reins to Sarah. "Stay here with the horses." He walked down the slope into the clearing. Removing his hat, his boots crunched on wood shavings and sawdust. The woman heard him approach, turned with startled eyes. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 30. Her hands were calloused, her face sun-weathered, but her eyes held depth and intelligence. "Ma'am," Thomas said, "that beam's a two-person job. Mind if we lend a hand?" He expected refusal, expected wounded pride or defensive independence. Which Instead, Elizabeth straightened, wiped sawdust from her hands, and smiled. The expression transformed her tired face, brought light to her features. "I can do this alone," she said honestly. "But I'd be foolish to refuse good help." "Thank you." Her humility caught him off guard. This wasn't stubborn isolation or forced self-sufficiency. This was genuine wisdom, knowing the difference between capability and foolishness. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a wall beginning to crack. "Thomas Edwards," he said. "Those are my children up on the ridge. Elizabeth Brennan, you're the family that rides by each week." "Your son has a powerful voice." Thomas laughed, surprised by the sound. Samuel's never met a thought he couldn't share loudly. They positioned themselves at either end of the beam. Elizabeth called out measurements, explaining her plan. She knew her craft, every angle calculated, every joint considered. Together they lifted the beam, walking it upward until it rested in the notches she'd cut. She secured it with practiced efficiency. "Papa, can we help?" Sarah's voice called from above. Elizabeth looked at Thomas, eyebrows raised. He nodded. The children scrambled down. Suddenly animated in a way he hadn't seen in months, Elizabeth treated them with easy respect, explaining her pulley system, letting Samuel hand her nails, praising Sarah's steady hands when she helped measure the next beam. When the work reached a natural pause, Elizabeth gestured to her campfire. "I've got coffee on if you're inclined." They sat on stumps arranged around the fire. Elizabeth poured coffee into tin cups, offered jerky and hardtack. Simple hospitality. Nothing fancy, but genuine. Samuel launched into a story about a coyote he'd seen, and Elizabeth listened with real attention. Sarah asked questions about the cabin, and Elizabeth answered thoughtfully, explaining load-bearing walls and roof pitch. Thomas watched his children come alive, watched color return to their cheeks and animation to their voices, watched them be seen and valued by someone new. Something in his chest continued cracking, ice giving way to running water. You've got good help here, Elizabeth said quietly, meaning the children. Ah, they're the best thing I ever had a hand in making. Thomas replied. Elizabeth's eyes flickered with understanding. Some shared recognition of loss and love. She didn't ask about their mother, and Thomas felt grateful. Some stories revealed themselves slowly. In their own time, the sun climbed higher. Thomas realized they'd been there over an hour. Longer than any social call he'd made since Martha died. We should get back to our fence line. Thank you for the help, Elizabeth said. And for the company. It's been mostly quiet out here. We ride this way every Saturday. Thomas heard himself say, if you need an extra hand with heavy work, we're available. Elizabeth's smile returned. I'd like that. They rode home in comfortable silence until Sarah said, She's nice, Papa. And she didn't mind us helping. Asti, Samuel bounced in his saddle. She laughed at my joke about the crooked nail. Did you hear her laugh? Papa. Thomas had heard. The sound had been like bird song after winter silence. His children were starving for exactly this easy companionship, shared purpose. Someone who welcomed rather than merely tolerated their presence. He'd been so focused on managing their household that he'd forgotten they needed warmth as much as shelter. She seems like a capable woman, Thomas said carefully. She's teaching me about notching logs next week, Sarah said, next week, as if it was decided, as if visiting Elizabeth's cabin was now part of their routine. Thomas should probably correct that assumption, remind them not to impose, but he couldn't bring himself to speak the words, because his own heart was already anticipating next Saturday. The visits became as regular as the seasons turning. Each Saturday, Thomas and the children timed their fence ride to stop at Elizabeth's clearing. Thomas brought proper tools a level. A better saw. Extra rope. Elizabeth accepted with grace, never diminishing her own capability but acknowledging that good tools made better work. The cabin grew taller. Walls rose course by course, windows framed and shuttered. A chimney taking shape with carefully mortared stone. Sarah learned to read wood grain, to understand which pieces would bear weight and which would split. Insano and man, die. Samuel mixed mortar with patient attention. His small hands learning the feel of proper consistency. They worked together with easy rhythm, conversation flowing naturally between hammers and saws. Thomas watched Elizabeth teach his children, and admiration grew into something warmer. She never condescended, never dismissed their questions as childish. When Samuel made a mistake, she showed him how to correct it without shame. When Sarah struggled with a difficult cut, Elizabeth guided her hands but let the girl do the work herself. You're patient with them, Thomas said one afternoon as they fitted a window frame. They're good students, curious and willing. Elizabeth tested the frame's fit. Children aren't meant to be quiet and forgotten. They're meant to question and learn and take up space in the world. The words landed heavy. Thomas realized his children had been doing exactly that, making themselves small, subdued, less than they were meant to be. He'd been so lost in grief that he'd forgotten children needed noise and mess, and the freedom to be fully themselves. During their shared meal that day, Elizabeth had started preparing extra food. Anticipating their visit, the conversation turned personal. They sat around her campfire, the half-finished cabin providing windbreak, late spring sunshine warming the clearing. I was married once, Elizabeth said quietly, offering the information like a gift. My husband Daniel died 3 years ago. Mining accident back in Pennsylvania. We'd been together since we were 17. Sarah reached out, touched Elizabeth's hand with child's instinctive compassion. Elizabeth smiled at her, squeezed back gently. I'm sorry for your loss, Thomas said, meaning it, after he died. I couldn't breathe in that town anymore. Every street corner held a memory. Every neighbor looked at me with pity. I needed to start fresh. Somewhere the grief wasn't the only thing anyone saw when they looked at me. Elizabeth stirred the fire with a stick. I learned I could survive alone. Built this cabin to prove it. I suppose. But I'm learning there's a difference between surviving and living. The words resonated through Thomas like a bell struck true. I've been surviving, he admitted. My wife Martha passed 2 winters ago. I thought keeping busy meant keeping whole. Thought if I just managed everything, controlled everything, kept us moving forward, that would be enough. But it's not, Elizabeth said softly. No, it's not. Thomas looked at his children, saw them listening with careful attention. My kids were becoming ghosts in their own home. Quiet and careful, taking up less space. That's not what Martha would have wanted. That's not what they deserve. Samuel leaned against his father's side. Sarah's eyes glistened with tears she didn't shed. Elizabeth nodded understanding. No judgment in her expression. Building this cabin taught me something, she said. Every log needs another log to stand against it. Alone. They're just timber lying in the dirt. Together. They're walls that shelter and protect. Maybe people work the same way. The afternoon stretched long and golden. They finished the window frame. Started on another. The children gathered wildflowers, presenting them to Elizabeth with shy pride. She found a jar, arranged them with care, set them on the windowsill that would one day have glass, as the sun lowered. Thomas helped Elizabeth cover her tools and supplies. His hand brushed hers as they folded a tarp, and the contact sent warmth through his arm. Elizabeth met his eyes. Something unspoken passing between them. Not love yet, but recognition. Possibility. The sense that walls were coming down on both sides. Riding home. Sarah said quietly. Elizabeth feels like she's safe. Papa. Like Mama used to feel. And the words both comforted and terrified Thomas. His daughter was attaching, bonding to Elizabeth in ways that could bring either healing or more heartbreak. But maybe that was the risk of living. Maybe you couldn't protect anyone from loss. Could only teach them that connection was worth the vulnerability. But that night, Thomas lay in bed thinking about Elizabeth's words. Timber and logs. Alone and together. Surviving and living. He'd been a lone log lying in the dirt for 2 years. Maybe it was time to let himself be part of something that stood upright. Something that sheltered and warmed. Something that looked like family again. The late spring storm rolled in with unusual violence. Dark clouds boiling over the mountains. Thomas saw it coming mid-morning and knew immediately Elizabeth would be in danger. The cabin wasn't finished still. No roof. Walls only 3/4 high. Rain would destroy weeks of work. Warp the exposed wood. Undermine the foundation. He saddled horses without discussion. Sarah and Samuel understood, moved with quick efficiency. They rode hard toward the clearing. Rain already beginning to fall in fat. Heavy drops. Elizabeth stood in the midst of chaos, frantically securing tarps over her stacked lumber. The wind tore at the canvas, making the work nearly impossible alone. She draped smaller tarps over the cabin walls, but they weren't enough. Wouldn't hold against serious storm. Elizabeth. Thomas shouted over rising wind. Leave it, come back to the ranch. So she turned. Rain already plastering her hair to her skull. This is my land. My future. I can't just abandon it. Thomas understood the desperation in her eyes. This cabin represented everything she'd invested: money, hope, identity. Walking away felt like surrender, like admitting she couldn't protect what she'd built. But stubbornness in the face of nature was foolishness. "Then we help you secure it." He dismounted, began hauling heavier tarps from his saddlebag. They worked together against the storm's fury. Sarah and Samuel helped weight tarp corners with stones. Elizabeth showed them which walls needed protection most. Rain came harder, turning the clearing to mud. Wind howled through the incomplete structure, threatening to tear everything apart. Thomas and Elizabeth braced the vulnerable south wall with poles, roping everything down with desperate strength. His shoulder brushed hers as they worked, rain streaming down their faces, breath coming hard. This was as close as the story came to danger, not violence, but nature's raw power, testing human determination. They barely finished before the storm's full force hit. Elizabeth's tent was the only shelter, and they crowded inside 4 people and soaked clothes in a space meant for 1. Samuel was shivering, and Elizabeth wrapped him in her only dry blanket. Sarah pressed against her father's side. The tent walls snapped and bulged but held. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, teeth chattering. "I should have listened. Should have come to the ranch." "You were protecting what matters," Thomas replied. "Can't fault a person for that." The storm raged for hours. They spoke little, conserving warmth. Samuel fell asleep against Elizabeth's shoulder, his small face peaceful despite the chaos outside. Sarah held her father's hand on one side, Elizabeth's on the other, creating a human chain of connection. The intimacy of the moment, 4 people pressed together, vulnerable and dependent, felt more profound than any spoken declaration. Thomas watched Elizabeth across the tent's dim interior. Her hair hung in wet ropes, her dress muddy and torn. She looked exhausted and beautiful, strong and fragile, exactly like someone who'd fought a storm and survived. When she smiled at him, he felt his heart open wider. Then guilt crashed over him like a wave. What was he doing? His children were attaching to a woman they barely knew. He was developing feelings that seemed to dishonor Martha's memory. This connection had grown too fast, too deep. What if Elizabeth left? What if she decided frontier life wasn't for her after all? What if this was just loneliness making him grasp at the first warmth he'd found? The storm broke near evening. They emerged to survey the damage tarps held. Walls intact, Elizabeth's careful work preserved. The clearing was a muddy disaster, but the structure had survived. Thomas felt numb, watching Elizabeth check her foundation stones, her expression relieved and grateful. Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have saved it alone." "That's what neighbors do," Thomas replied, keeping his voice formal. Distant, Elizabeth's face showed confusion at his sudden coldness. Sarah looked between them. Sensing the shift, Thomas couldn't explain. Couldn't find words for the fear and guilt churning in his chest. He just needed distance. Needed to think. Needed to not feel so much. "We should head home," he said. "Get the children dried out." "Of course." Elizabeth stepped back, wrapping arms around herself. "Thank you again." They rode away in silence. The storm had passed, but tension remained, thick and uncomfortable. Sarah finally spoke, voice small and hurt. "Papa, why were you cold to Elizabeth? She helped us, and we helped her." Thomas had no answer. His fear spoke louder than his sense, louder than his children's need, louder than the truth he knew in his bones that Elizabeth had become important, that her cabin was becoming home, that his heart was opening whether he wanted it to or not. And sometimes the scariest thing wasn't the storm outside. It was the storm inside. The one that threatened to sweep away all your careful control and leave you vulnerable to joy and loss in equal measure. Thomas rode home in silence, water dripping from his hat brim, knowing he'd hurt someone who'd done nothing but offer grace and warmth, knowing his fear had just built walls where windows should be, knowing he'd chosen winter again when spring had been right there in front of him. 2 weeks passed. Thomas avoided the clearing, told himself he was too busy with ranch work. Hay needed cutting, fences needed mending, the children needed teaching. All true, all excuse. The house felt emptier than before, having tasted warmth made cold unbearable. The children went through their routines, subdued, their brief animation fading back into quiet compliance. They didn't ask about Elizabeth directly, but their silence asked the question Thomas couldn't answer. He worked himself exhausted each day, fell into bed too tired to think, but thoughts came anyway in the darkness. Elizabeth's smile around the campfire, Sarah's joy learning to notch logs, Samuel sleeping peacefully against Elizabeth's shoulder, the sense of rightness, of puzzle pieces finding their proper places, and guilt. Always guilt. Martha had been gone only 2 years. We torment hard. Was this betrayal? Was he replacing her? Would she hate him for moving forward so quickly? On the May 14th night, Sarah approached him after supper. Her small face showed determination beyond her years. Papa, did we do something wrong? Is that why we can't see Elizabeth anymore? The question pierced him. No. Sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. Then why won't you take us back? Thomas looked at his daughter, saw Martha's courage reflected there. The courage to ask hard questions, to push past comfort into truth. He'd been lying to his children through silence, teaching them that avoidance was strength, when it was actually cowardice. I'm afraid, he admitted. Of what? Of caring again, of losing again, of dishonoring your mother's memory by feeling things for someone else. Daffurin, I dit in. The words spilled out, honest and raw. I loved your mama with everything I had. When she died, I thought I died too. Thought the best I could do was keep moving, keep managing, keep us surviving. But Elizabeth made me feel alive again, and that terrified me. Sarah climbed into his lap, though she was nearly too big. Mama wouldn't want us to be sad forever. Papa. She told me once that love makes more love, that caring about new people doesn't take away from the people you've already loved. Samuel appeared at his elbow. Mama used to say her heart got bigger every time she loved someone new. She said her heart grew big enough to hold the whole world because she practiced loving. And I'll tree. Thomas pulled both children close, felt tears he'd been holding for weeks finally break free. His children carried Martha's wisdom, her generous spirit. They understood better than he did that love wasn't finite. Iksaba imiasatba, that opening your heart to new people, honored the past instead of betraying it. Water called for him. He sat there after midnight, children finally asleep, and let himself remember, not just Martha's death, but her life, her laughter and warmth and absolute conviction that life was meant to be shared. She'd believed in building family, in welcoming people into their circle. She'd made their home a place of light and joy. By closing himself off, by building walls, by choosing isolation. He wasn't protecting her memory. He was diminishing it. Martha would hate what he'd become. She'd hate seeing her children subdued and careful, hate watching Thomas lock himself away from life. She'd be furious at his waste of time and possibility. Thomas walked to the bedroom that had been theirs, picked up Martha's photograph in the darkness. "I miss you," he whispered. "Every day I miss you. But you wouldn't want me to stop living. You'd want me to love our children enough to show them that hearts can heal. Yastal, that new love doesn't replace old love. Just adds to it." He could almost hear her voice. Could almost feel her hand on his shoulder. Martha had believed love was a fire the more you shared, the brighter it burned. He'd built his marriage on that truth. Why abandon it now? Elizabeth is good and kind. He continued. She's strong and capable and wise. She makes the children laugh. She makes me feel alive. I think you'd like her. Martha. I think you'd want me to choose courage over fear, to choose spring over winter. Something loosened in his chest, a knot he'd been carrying for 2 years. Not permission exactly. He didn't need permission to keep living. But clarity, understanding that honoring Martha meant living fully, loving openly, teaching their children that loss was part of life, but not the end of it. Morning came with decision made. Thomas woke the children before dawn. Get dressed. We're riding out. They understood immediately. Faces bright with hope. They moved with purpose, with life, with the kind of energy he'd missed without knowing it. They rode toward the clearing as the sun climbed, painting the world gold and green. Summer had finally arrived while Thomas had been locked in winter. The cabin came into view, and Thomas's heart clenched. Elizabeth had worked herself nearly to exhaustion these past 2 weeks. The walls were complete now. The roof framed but not finished. She stood near her campfire, tin cup in hand, and turned at the sound of horses. Her face showed surprise, then careful neutrality. She'd been hurt by his distance, had armored herself against more pain. Thomas dismounted, walked toward her with his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I was afraid of dishonoring my wife's memory, afraid of my children's hearts, afraid of my own. But I was wrong. The bravest thing isn't standing alone. It's choosing to build together." Elizabeth set down her cup. "I've been afraid too. Afraid that needing people makes me weak. That accepting help means I failed at being strong. We've both been building walls when we should have been building bridges." Thomas said. Samuel ran to Elizabeth, threw his arms around her waist. Sarah followed more shyly but with equal warmth. Elizabeth held them both, tears sliding down her cheeks, over their heads. Her eyes met Thomas's, and he saw everything he felt reflected there. Fear and hope, grief and possibility, the courage to try again despite risk. "Help me finish this cabin," Elizabeth asked quietly. "We'll finish it together," Thomas promised. "If you'll have us, I'd like nothing more." The final push on the cabin became a celebration. Thomas brought proper roofing materials from town shingles and tar paper. A gift? Not a loan. Word spread somehow, the way it did in frontier communities. And neighbors appeared to lend hands. The widow Fletcher brought food. The Peterson brothers arrived with extra tools. Even the circuit preacher stopped by, offering blessing and strong arms. What had started as one woman's solitary endeavor transformed into a community event. Where Thomas worked beside Elizabeth, their rhythm synchronized from weeks of practice. She anticipated his movements. He understood her vision. They lifted the final roof beams together, fitting them into place with satisfying precision. Sarah and Samuel ran between workers, fetching tools and nails. their laughter ringing across the clearing. Children from neighboring homesteads joined them, turning the work into play. Someone produced a fiddle during the midday break, and impromptu music filled the air. As the roof took shape overhead, Thomas and Elizabeth paused for water. They stood in the shade of the nearly complete cabin, watching neighbors work with easy cooperation. The structure they'd built together stood solid and true. Walls that would shelter, a roof that would protect, a foundation that would endure. And when this cabin's done, Thomas said quietly, for her ears only, I hope you won't be a stranger at our ranch. My children need you. I need you. Elizabeth paused, the tin cup halfway to her lips. She looked at him with those deep eyes that had first captured his attention weeks ago on the ridge. I built this cabin to prove I could stand alone. But somewhere along the way, I learned I don't want to. I want family. I want your family. The words hung between them, simple and profound. Not a formal proposal, they'd take their time with that, do things properly, but a recognition of intention, an acknowledgement that what they were building extended beyond timber and nails. The widow Fletcher called them back to work, and the moment passed into action. But something had shifted, settled, become solid. By mid-afternoon, the roof was complete. Shingles covered the cabin from peak to eaves. The structure finally weatherproof and whole. Neighbors stood back to admire their collective work, offering congratulations and well wishes. The Peterson brothers presented Elizabeth with a hand-carved door, solid oak with iron hinges. Every home needs a proper entrance. The elder brother said. They installed it together, and Elizabeth stood in the threshold, between outside and inside, past and future, alone and together. She touched the door frame with reverence, this marker of completed shelter, this symbol of transition. The gathering became a picnic as evening approached. Elizabeth shared the food she'd prepared, supplemented by what neighbors brought. They ate and talked, children playing in the fading light, adults swapping stories and plans. Thomas sat with his children on one side, Elizabeth on the other, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years: belonging, community, the warmth of being part of something larger than grief. As the sun lowered, neighbors began departing with final congratulations. Elizabeth thanked each one, her voice thick with emotion. When the clearing finally emptied, only Thomas and his children remained. They stood together looking at the completed cabin. Sunset painted it gold, smoke from Elizabeth's campfire curling skyward. The whole scene suffused with peace. Samuel leaned against Elizabeth. Sarah held her hand. Thomas felt his heart expand, making room for this woman who'd come into their lives through determination and grace. You did it, Thomas said softly. We did it, Elizabeth corrected. I couldn't have finished alone. The cabin stood as testament to more than carpentry skill. It represented partnership, community, the strength found in accepting help. Most of all, it represented the possibility that hearts could heal, that families could grow. That spring always followed winter, if you had the courage to wait and work. Birthday. Thank you, Elizabeth whispered, and Thomas understood she meant for more than the roof beams. Thank you, he replied, and meant the same. 6 weeks later, summer sat full and heavy on the land. Thomas rode the fence line with his children as he always had, but everything felt different now. They laughed and sang, pointed out birds' nests and wildflowers, existed in the world with the kind of ease that spoke of healed hearts. They weren't checking fence. They were heading to Elizabeth's cabin for Sunday supper, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The cabin looked like a home now. Curtains hung in the windows, colorful fabrics softening the rough timber. A garden flourished beside the structure, vegetables in neat rows, flowers along the borders. Smoke curled from the chimney despite summer warmth. Elizabeth baking bread in her new stove. She emerged as they approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her face lit up at the sight of them, and Thomas felt his heart respond. Shani oblique the high. The past weeks had been a slow courtship conducted with frontier propriety, shared meals and long conversations. Her visits to the ranch for Sunday services, his children spending afternoons learning from her capable hands. They were building something together. Foundation laid one careful piece at a time. Much like the cabin itself. Thomas dismounted, helped his children down. Samuel ran to show Elizabeth a particularly interesting rock he'd found. Iasian Dakiro. Sarah followed with a basket of early berries they'd picked. Ikyonchandero. The door stood open, welcoming them into warmth and the smell of baking bread. But Thomas paused at the threshold, pulled a package from his saddlebag. He'd worked on it for 2 weeks, carving in the evenings after the children slept. His hands, more comfortable with rope and leather than fine detail, had nevertheless produced something he was proud of. "I made this for you," he said, holding out the wrapped bundle. Elizabeth set down her bowl, took the package with careful hands. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a wooden sign, hand-carved and sanded smooth. The letters read, Edwards and Elizabeth, with an intentional blank space where her last name could be added. Later, Science. Below that, smaller, Est 1876. Elizabeth traced the carved letters, tears gathering in her eyes. She understood the meaning without explanation. This was proposal and promise, invitation and commitment. Thomas was asking if she wanted to join their family, to merge her foundation with theirs, to build something lasting together. "I came here to build a cabin," she said, voice breaking. "I found a family instead." Samuel and Sarah crowded close, excited by what they sensed happening. "Adihine. Does this mean you'll be our family for real?" Samuel asked. Elizabeth knelt to their level, holding both children gently. "If that's what you want, if your papa thinks it's right." "We want it," Sarah said firmly. "Oi, show. We've wanted it since the first time you let us help build." Elizabeth looked up at Thomas, question and hope mingling in her expression. He reached down, helped her stand, kept her hand in his. "Martha taught me that love isn't a pie where more people means smaller slices. It's a fire the more you share, the brighter it burns." He touched his wedding ring, then looked at Elizabeth. "I think she'd like you. I think she'd be glad we found each other. I know she'd want our children to have your strength and wisdom in their lives. I can never replace her." Elizabeth said quietly, "You're not meant to replace her. You're meant to add to what we're building. To help us grow into something new while honoring what came before." Thomas squeezed her hand. "So yes, join our family. Marry me when you're ready. Let us finish building this life together." Elizabeth answered by pulling him close, holding tight while the children cheered and danced around them. The sign fell to the ground, and Thomas thought he'd pick it up later, hang it with proper ceremony. For now, this embrace was enough strong arms and willing hearts. Choosing connection over isolation. Choosing life over mere survival. They went inside for supper, the cabin filling with noise and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family. Through the window, the land stretched summer green and promising. The garden grew abundant. The fence lines Thomas had ridden alone for so long now led to a place of warmth and welcome. As evening deepened, Thomas stood at the door looking out. The cabin Elizabeth had built one log at a time now sheltered something more precious than possessions. It sheltered hope. Behind him, Elizabeth moved about the kitchen while the children set the table, their voices blending in natural harmony. "Thank you," he whispered to Martha's memory. "Arta Grace, for teaching me that love multiplies instead of dividing, for giving me these incredible children, for showing me that the strongest timber stands together. The past didn't disappear." Martha lived on in their daughter's courage, their son's joy, in the lessons of generosity and welcome that shaped their home. But the future stretched bright and open, full of possibility, as twilight fell. Lamplight glowed from the cabin windows, a beacon against the darkening sky. Inside, there was laughter and the clatter of dishes, the sounds of home. The camera would pull back now, showing the cabin solid and complete, smoke curling from the chimney, the garden growing, children visible through windows, two adults moving in synchronized partnership. What Thomas and Elizabeth had built together was more than a structure of timber and nails. It was trust and respect and chosen love. It was proof that independence and interdependence weren't opposites but foundations of genuine family. It was the understanding that accepting help with grace showed wisdom, not weakness. The frontier stretched vast around them, no longer lonely but full of promise, one log at a time. They'd built shelter, one day at a time. They'd build a life together. And that, Thomas thought as he turned back to warmth and family, was the bravest thing of all.